If you own one of these Winix C535s, this sound might be familiar to you, and today we're going to try to fix it. These are some of the tools you'll need to replace the bearings in your noisy Winix air purifier. I wanted to credit Tisher for his in-depth teardown video which I followed. I made a few modifications, but it allowed me to complete these repairs. The first mistake I made was this. I bought a generic set and tried to save a few dollars. However, I had to send them back to Amazon because the tolerances varied wildly. These are the actual bearings that I ended up using, the NSK608ZZ, and these are also the ones that were recommended in Tisher's video that I watched. However, again, I tried to save a couple of dollars, figuring how bad could they be? I found out how bad they could be. Start by removing all of your filters, and you'll have access to 6 Phillips head screws on the front, 2 Phillips head on the rear. There's one screw holding the junction box cover on. Remove that. There's also one screw holding the base on. Remove that as well. Disconnect all harnesses and the 4 Phillips head screws to separate the shell again. Flip it over and use a 10mm socket or wrench to remove the fan. 4 more Phillips head screws to remove the motor bracket. Fish the wiring harness out, remove the clip, and you can remove the motor. There's a rubber bushing on the front and on the rear of the motor. Remove those as well. To prevent damage to the integrated circuit, I used heat to loosen the thermal epoxy by heating the metal side of the motor housing. Next, I separate the housing by using a flathead in each of the 4 grooves and tapping it with a hammer. These 3 areas will have to be desoldered in order to lift the circuit board. Oh, reload. Sometimes switching to your secondary is quicker than reloading. For full transparency, I'm genuinely terrible with the soldering iron, and this is the part of the project that I dreaded the most. However, I was able to get it done, so most people should be in pretty good shape. Once you remove the solder, remove the circuit board from the housing. Now just grab the shaft and pull up. It's held in place by a magnet. This exposes both bearings, front and rear. Next, I used a pick to remove the E-clip from the shaft behind the bearing, and I used a Harbor Freight bearing puller to pull the top bearing off. However, it was kind of awkward and cumbersome, so I think tapping it off with a pry bar is a better solution. I put the E-clip back on the shaft in its groove, and then I found a socket that fit over the shaft and only touched the inner race of the bearing, and I tapped it on until it reached that E-clip. I did the same for the bottom side. Now it's pretty much everything in reverse. I put the shaft back into the housing, put the circuit board back on top, and I lined up each of the 3 pins, and oh, soldering iron. We meet again. I soldered the 3 leads that I desoldered earlier, and I was actually kind of proud of myself here because I suck at soldering, and it wasn't that hard. Now I put this sheet back into place. It looks like maybe a dust shield of some sort. And then I take the wave washer and I set it on top of the bearing. Be careful not to lose that. Here I'm going to scrape this old epoxy off of the housing. Next, I'm going to use Arctic MX4, which is a thermal paste that I typically use for CPUs or GPUs. It's not going to have any holding properties or adhesive properties, but it will help dissipate heat. And I'm not even sure if this step is needed, but I'm going to do it because it won't hurt anything. Now that the thermal epoxy has been scraped off, I'm going to put this metal part of the housing back on in the same orientation that it came off, mainly because some of the plastic was chipped when I separated it, which is fine. Lastly, I use a pressure clamp to apply pressure to the edges to reseat the two parts of the motor housing. It might be overkill. I feel like it could have been done by hand, but since I already had my toolbox open, why not? From here, everything is just going to be again put back together in reverse. The two rubber bushings on the motor, then feed the wiring harness through the shell, lock it in place with the little tabs. So the orientation is washer, fan, and then washer again. And I used blue Loctite because that's what was on the nut from the factory. Now as I continue to reassemble this unit, making sure I plug in all the wiring harnesses into the junction box before placing its cover back on, I was able to complete this process on two different Winix C535s, and the total time spent for both of them was about an hour. So, roughly 30 minutes each, I would say. The things that I had the most difficulty with were desoldering the leads because I'm just terrible with a soldering iron. Surprisingly, I was able to resolder them pretty easily because there's a lot of space on that circuit board. And one of the units, the bearings were a little more stubborn to remove, but not by much. Luckily, I had all of the tools on hand. The only thing I had to order were the bearings. I tried a generic no-name brand that was cheap on Amazon, had to send them back. They didn't fit right, so I had to go with the NSK 608 ZZs. And here is the reveal.